Hello and welcome to Bible Truth Niagara, a YouTube site for people who believe the Bible to be God's inspired word, which has been relevant through all the ages and still is today. You know, it doesn't seem to matter how long a person has been a reader or advocate of the Bible, they still go through difficult times in their life. And the scriptures say to expect as much. In the first book of Peter at chapter 4, verse 12, we're told, "Do not be surprised at the painful trial that you are suffering, as though something strange were happening to you." It's normal to have trials and tribulations. Everyone does, no matter who they are. Have you ever gone through a time where you have felt so weighed down by the complexities and questions that you are wrestling with that you identified with the psalmist at Psalm 43, verse 2, where he says, "God, why have you rejected me? Why must I go about mourning and oppressed?" In other words, God, where are you? Don't you see me struggling here? Why aren't you helping me? God, don't you care? If you're not a committed Christian, but have always sort of believed there was a God, during times of trial, you may question whether God even exists. You may begin to wonder if the casual belief that you've had in Him all along was really just wishful thinking. Maybe you're going through a difficult time right now. Some people just seem to have more than their fair share of crises and burdens. Sometimes they're short-lived, lasting only a few days, but more often they drag on for weeks, for months, even for years. Life can become intolerable. Yet no matter how short or long a time it is that we're in distress, when we're in the thick of it, it's always too long, isn't it? It seems like it will never end. When we're experiencing this kind of suffering and pain, when we're exhausted from constant, unrelenting stress, we need reassurance and answers. There have been times in my life when I have had an important decision to make and absolutely did not know which way to go with it. During those times I've prayed, "God, will you tell me what to do? Just write it in the sky with clouds or something. Anything, please, I need help now." Well, God never answered me that way, yet. But He has communicated to me through a verse of Scripture, a comment made by a child or a stranger, a book that I just happened to come across, and even the lyrics of a song that played on the radio at just the right time. I have taken each of these as a sign from God that He was near, that He understood what I was going through, and that He cared. And that helped me so much. Many people have had similar experiences. After praying for help, amazingly, an unexpected check arrives in the mail just in time to pay an important bill. Or a neighbor happens to mention that they know someone hiring in your field when you haven't told anyone yet that you have recently lost your job. And the list goes on and on. Some might call these coincidences, but to those on the receiving end, they feel the presence of a loving God saying, "Don't be afraid. I've got your back. Just keep trusting in me. I'll help you get through this." When we experience this kind of divine intervention through answered prayer, the doubts that we had about God are instantly erased. A committed believer's faith is strengthened, and a casual believer is drawn towards a closer relationship with the God whom they have taken for granted for far too long. I'd like to tell you a story now about answered prayer. It's called Healing Rain. Imagine a sunny spring morning. A man and his teenage daughter are planting tomato seedlings in the field behind their country home. A few hundred of them. Why so many? Because this 59-year-old widower has always loved growing things. This is good therapy for him. Neither he nor his daughter can begin to imagine how much this particular day will impact them for the rest of their lives. It had been a very hard winter. The funeral in mid-December had made all of the usual holiday traditions seem completely out of place. Without realizing it, the girl, Joni, had fallen into a mild depression after her mother's death, but had pulled out of it with the returning warmth of spring. At that point, she had the eyes to see that her father, she called him Pup, was still deep in his pit of grief. Come to think of it, she couldn't remember seeing him smile since before her mom got sick last summer. He looked so broken. Joni longed to see her father smile again. But what could a mere 17-year-old girl do to help her grieving father heal? She felt powerless. Just as powerless as when her mom lay dying in the hospital. It was heart-wrenching to have to stand there and feel so helpless. How could God let this happen? Her parents had bought this hobby farm to enjoy their retirement years on together. And now, that would never be. It just wasn't fair. Didn't God care? Now, Joni never doubted that God existed. Her parents had always taught her that God was kind and wise. But she didn't understand how that fit into her circumstances now. She was confused. In the kitchen, Pup stood at the sink window, surveying his acre of new charges, drooping in the sun. "Now all we need is some rain," he announced. Standing behind him, Joni's heart leapt into a silent, urgent plea. "Oh God, please, send rain. Not for me, for Pup. He needs so much for these tomato plants to grow. Oh, please, please, don't let them die too." She peered for a moment at the cloudless sky and went to her room. A short time later, Joni was startled by the sound of wind. She jumped up to see dark clouds outside her window. A few drops hit the glass. Running to the kitchen, she stopped short. There was Pup, still looking out the sink window, with a smile on his face. Wordlessly, the two watched in awe as the clouds burst, pounding the roof and darkening the soil in the field. Joni's heart soared with gratitude. "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you," she prayed. Oh, she could hardly believe it. Her prayer had been answered. Then a sudden thought took her smile away. What if this was all just a coincidence? What if this rain would have come anyway and she just happened to pray for it before the first clouds rolled in? Oh well, as long as it was raining, Joni didn't really care how or why. Pup was happy, and that was all that mattered to her. 20 minutes of heavy downpour created streams in the field between the rows. Pup started to look worried. "This is almost too much rain," he said. What, thought Joni? Too much rain? Desperately, she looked up at the clouds. Within the silent confines of her mind, she yelled out, "Okay, you can stop now." Oh no, she thought. If these tomato plants drown, Pup will be crushed. Joni couldn't bear to see her father beaten down again. Within a minute, miraculously, the deluge slowed right down to a gentle shower. And within 5 minutes, the rain had stopped completely. Joni was amazed. Could it be? Could it really be that this time this was God's doing? Or was it just another coincidence? She didn't know what to think. That evening at a store in town, Joni couldn't help but overhear some neighbors talking. "Hey, did you get caught in the downpour today?" "Downpour? What downpour?" The store clerk interrupted. "I've been listening to folks talk about this all afternoon," he said. "It appears that even though the weathermen called for blue skies all day, it poured buckets around noon, but only from Maple Street to the Town Line Road and from the highway to Memorial Drive, about a 2-mile radius. We didn't get a drop here in town." Joni's eyes widened. She swallowed hard as the impact of what she just heard hit her like a tidal wave. Their farm was in the center of that 2-mile radius. Her heart pounded with realization that God actually had heard and answered her both times. She was in shock. It would take a while for all of this to fully sink in. But at that moment, Joni knew one thing. She knew that whatever God's reason was for allowing death to separate her parents, it wasn't because He didn't care. Not if He cared enough to send healing rain at the request of a teenager to keep a few tomato plants alive. Pup spent many therapeutic hours in the field that summer, hoeing, tending, and picking his tomatoes. Joni watched him climb steadily out of the pit of grief that had held him captive for so long. And for the rest of her life, whenever Joni experienced times of doubt or despair, the memory of that healing rain flooded her heart with reassurance that God really was near and cared. This story is true. It happened in 1975. I know that because in the spring of 1975, I was 17 years old. I am Joni. Pup remarried 2 years later, and he and my stepmother thrived on that hobby farm for 20 years before they downsized to an apartment. Pup lived out his final years with an attitude of gratitude for all of the many experiences of his long, full life. He had come a long way since that spring day in 1975 when the skies poured down the healing rain. And so had I. You know, you don't have to experience an isolated rainstorm to know that God exists, that He understands the difficult situation you're in, and that He cares. God can use a multitude of ways to tell you that, but He wants you to ask Him. He wants to see some initiative on your part. In the book of James, at chapter 4, verse 8, James writes, "Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you." God is waiting for you to take one small baby step towards Him so that He can respond with 10 giant steps towards you. And humility is the key. In Psalm 51, David wrote that God will never spurn an honest and contrite heart. And David is our example because in chapter 34 of Psalms, he, the king of Israel, describes himself as this poor man. That's humility. He said, "This poor man called, and the Lord heard him." Then he challenges us to taste and see that the Lord is good. It's okay to ask God for a taste of Him. And finally, in the book of Acts at chapter 17, the Apostle Paul tells us that God wants us to seek Him, to feel after Him, and find Him, though He is not far from any one of us. God is near, He cares, and He wants to hear from you. Besides our own experiences of answered prayer, it is very helpful to hear other people's stories of how God has answered their prayers. Talk to a great-grandmother who's been baptized for 60 years, or an uncle who converted 10 years ago, or that neighbor who you've noticed leaves their house every Sunday morning all dressed up. Ask them, has God ever obviously answered your prayers? You can be sure that their eyes will light up. They will be more than happy to relive the thrill they felt when they experienced God showing up in their life at a difficult time. I'd like to encourage you to share your experiences of answered prayer also. Don't keep it all to yourself. Tell your family, your friends, your neighbors, anyone who will listen. Your story will encourage others more than you can know. We here at Bible Truth Niagara would also love to hear your story of how God has answered your prayers. So please contact us through YouTube and let us know how God has shown up in your life. Thank you so much for your time and interest today. I pray that you've been encouraged. Bye for now.